Hey there, it's Emily Ronnow with Pet Dog USA, and as we get going with the Ask Emily series, I wanted to start with a couple quick little videos on theory which might be helpful as we go forward in answering questions. There's two theorists that I really see as the foundation of dog training and very helpful to keep in mind as we're working with our animals. The first is Pavlov and his work with classical conditioning, and that's what I'm going to talk about here in this video. Check back with us for our video on operant conditioning, the work of B.F. Skinner, and how that's relevant to you and your dog. So Pavlov was the one who was responsible for describing classical conditioning into mainstream psychology. And really what he did, if you will, is describe the perfect storm of efficiency of how something can become classically conditioned. So I'll start by just talking about what it means to have something become classically conditioning, what really is going on. Now, Pavlov was not about frontal lobe functioning. It wasn't about learned behavior necessarily. What Pavlov was really looking at is how a mammal's brain can come to associate something that originally has no meaning to that mammal, like a bell, with something that has what we call inherent meaning, like food. So a food, if you show a hungry dog food, you don't have to teach that dog what to do with it. They don't have to learn what to do with it. Their body has a natural, involuntary physiological reaction to the presence of food when they're hungry. Their brain releases chemistry, their mouths begin to water, and their stomachs prepare for digestion. Much the case with us as well. And I really enjoy the example of salivation for teaching classical conditioning because it's something that we can all identify with. If you think about the last time you were really hungry and you had your mouth water, it's a unique experience and something that we all identify with in the sense that we really don't have control over it. Not to be offensive to anyone, but you could be a vegan and very, very politically committed or emotionally committed to that lifestyle. And if you're hungry enough and somebody walks in with a steak, your body is going to react whether you want it to or not. This is because it's an involuntary physiological reaction. So what Pavlov was looking at was how is it that something that has no meaning to a dog, like a bell, can come to make them start to salivate. And as the story goes, I think what was happening, reading between the lines and a little bit of imagination, is that they were doing all these experiments, and pretty soon, every time the lab tech would walk into the room, all these dogs would start salivating. And so at some point, somebody stepped back and said, what's happened here? Because I'm fairly confident that a dog wouldn't salivate at the sight of a guy in a white coat in the wild. So what he started doing, Pavlov that is he started looking at this process by which something that has no meaning, like a bell, he used a bell and he had food, can come to be linked in a very physiological way in that dog's brain. So he had the bell and he tried ringing the bell and feeding the dogs at the same time. He tried ringing the bell and feeding the dogs 5 seconds later, and he tried feeding the dogs and ringing the bell afterwards. And over time and through his research, he described for us what he believed to be the most efficient way or the most efficient process by which that bell gets linked to food in a reliable way. So what he specifically described for his beagles and whatever type of food he was using, it was approximately 150 to 200 repetitions of the bell predicting food within a half a second. That sounds like a lot of repetitions, but it goes fast. And the next piece is to really tie in for you, why is this relevant to dog training? It's relevant on a couple of different fronts. The first of which is, if you have a dog at home, you've probably noticed by now that our dogs are not language creatures. They learn everything in the physical world first. So what that means is that if I want to be able to sit back on my couch with my cup of coffee and have my dog go to their bed or come to me when I call them or bring me my shoe or whatever it is that I'm trying to teach my dog to do, I first have to have a physical way to communicate with my dog. It all starts with having a physical way to show my dog what it is that I either want them to do or what I don't want them to do, whatever the case may be. Once I've established something in the physical world that has meaning and is predictable. I've rehearsed it, so to speak. So if I use the example of a sit command, most of us put food in our hands, and if we move the food over the dog's nose, the dog wants to keep their eyes on the food, and eventually it puts enough discomfort on their spine that they decide it's more comfortable to put their butt on the ground so that they can continue looking at the food. So after some time, I move my hand up like this, and the dog says, oh, I know the answer to this one. They pop their butt on the ground and they get a treat. This is an example of something in the physical world that I've rehearsed enough time, that movement of moving the food over the dog's nose, that eventually the food, that gesture has meaning to the dog. Once I've accomplished that, then I can use classical conditioning, referring back to the work of Pavlov, to make a sound like a vocal cue equal to that gesture in the physical world, or this thing that has already had meaning created for it. So in a nutshell, anytime we're putting things on a vocal cue, we are using classical conditioning to do so. What that means is that I need to have something in the physical world that has meaning for that dog. I need to be able to do something physically to get my dog to do whatever it is I'm asking him to do. And then it's 150 to 200 repetitions of my vocal cue predicting that event within a half a second for most dogs, and give and take depending on the motivation. The other place that classical conditioning shows up in dog training, and I think it's going to be relevant to our Ask Emily series, is what I call puppy gone sideways situations. So many times I'll get clients who are baffled by a dog, particularly dogs that are a little bit skittish or shut down, when you're dealing with adverse events, something that frightens a mammal or causes a stress reaction in the body. There's lots of science behind how the stress hormones or chemistry that's released in our bodies, cortisol levels, etc., that create some very long-lasting memories and a very acute timestamp sometimes. So if I have a dog who is all of a sudden acting really frightened in the garage, and he doesn't want to go through the garage, and he's just behaving oddly every time I go through that threshold to go to the garage, sometimes I get questions like these. And if you query back and start to ask, when was the last time I had the dog in the garage? And oh, well, we were getting ready to go to Tahoe, and we were getting all the stuff down for the snow, and all the saucers and sledding equipment came crashing down off the top shelf, and we forgot all about it because we were trying to get out of town. But in that moment, for that mammal, if it all lands in just the right way, you can have incidences of classical conditioning with adverse events that can be really lasting, that can happen in 1 or 2 repetitions. So if you have something like that going on and you have questions about it, you can feel free to reach out to me. You can also look up classical conditioning. There's lots of references. It's a very, very common theory. Many of you studied it in Psych 101. Feel free to reach out, and until next time, keep those tails a waggin'.